Has the debate about October 7th and the war that it started been as much a war about words as it is about deeds? If we're talking about the way the atrocities committed against Israelis and the Palestinian war to destroy the Jewish state is discussed in academia and the media, that's probably true. How have pro-Hamas propagandists been able to shape a narrative in which Israel is portrayed as the source and focus of evil in the world, and to transform murderers, rapists, and kidnappers into icons of liberation in the minds of many Americans, especially young people? The answer lies in their ability to turn opposing Israel and supporting Palestinian terrorism into a cosmic generational issue. Next, on Think Twice, we take a deep dive into the war over the words used to describe October 7th and the battle to destroy the Jewish state, with the editor of an important new collection of essays about how we think about October 7th. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with the editor of an important new collection of essays about October 7th and the way the world thinks about it. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. What have we learned about the world and the way it thinks about the conflict in the Middle East, as well as about Jews and Palestinian Arabs, since October 7th, 2023? The efforts of pro-Hamas activists to sell the world on the idea that the Palestinian decision to employ extreme violence, not so much as a tactic, but also as a strategy to inflame antisemitism, was something decent, progressive people should support, was an enormous success. Around the world, but particularly on college campuses and in the media, the cause of destroying the one Jewish state on the planet, something that could only be achieved by Jewish genocide, became not merely fashionable, but something that people who thought of themselves as good people felt bound to support. Palestinians who had committed the largest mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust in an orgy of murder, rape, torture, kidnapping, and wanton destruction were portrayed as victims rather than criminals, and their Jewish victims were depicted as having gotten what they deserved if the pro-Hamas mobs were also denying those crimes had even occurred, despite the abundant evidence of it provided by the perpetrators. How did this stunning effort to turn truth on its head succeed? And what are the implications, not merely for the future of the conflict between Jews and Arabs, but for the way antisemitism has surged and been normalized in Western discourse? Two people who have studied this issue deeply are Donna Robinson Divine and Asaf Ramarowski, and together they have produced a new book of essays breaking down the post-October 7th world in detail. The result was their new volume, October 7th, The Wars Over Words and Deeds, and we're pleased to have one of them with us today to discuss it. Donna Robinson Divine is Professor Emerita of Jewish Studies and Government at Smith College. She is the co-author of Women Living Change and the author of Politics and Society in Ottoman Palestine, as well as Exiled in the Homeland, Zionism and the Return to Mandate Palestine. Donna Robinson Divine, welcome to Think Twice.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Donna, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about the decision to take on such a big and important topic in this collection that you've just published. October 7th and the war it started has obviously been the subject of an ocean of commentary, not all of which is malicious propaganda, but it certainly has generated an endless debate. What were your main goals in initiating a book project about a topic about which so much has already been said and which is nevertheless something about which so many people who claim to have opinions about it really know so little about the details of what happened and why it occurred?
You point out the very reasons Asaf and I undertook this project. This isn't our first project about discourse and the distorted discourse about the Middle East. And for someone like me who taught Middle East politics for 40 years, this was both an event of world importance that has been described in ways that are so unmoored, unattached from history, politics, and what we know about political philosophy and the study of states and rights, that it just seemed too important a project to ignore. And again, for someone who's addicted, really addicted to the study of the Middle East, this is like being in a candy store. You cannot ignore all of the developments that are transpiring. And it's true that to explain what is happening, there's a certain amount of simplification that always goes on, that you're trying to use categories that capture what is happening. You're trying to make it sensible either to students or to a general audience that doesn't know as much. But this is something, this was an event. October 7th, savagery, was an event that is still reverberating, not only in the Middle East, and not only for Israel and for Palestinians in or outside of Gaza, but really it's a global conflict, and it is also an issue that discloses the massive failures in the understanding of the Middle East that have gone on now for decades and dominated the study of the Middle East on campuses. So this was an event, as small as it seems, or as narrow geographically as it seems, that has worldwide significance.
Yeah, I think that's very clear. Now, there are so many elements of the October 7th debate that are addressed in this book, and we don't have time to discuss all of them, each chapter. But in setting out on this project, what did you think were the topics that you thought had been the most reported and about which there has been the most ignorance? What was the most important thing to sort of set straight about this?
Well, first, I think we needed to set straight what was happening on the ground, the war. And I think Asaf and I both, each of us recognize that while we have knowledge and we think we are students, accurate students of the Middle East, we know that there are limits to our knowledge. So we reached out first and foremost to people who had the military expertise, who had the statistical expertise in aspects of what was, just to describe what was happening with more accuracy, which meant taking on the notions, the words that were used really promiscuously, like genocide and starvation and the casualty count, and the notion of urban warfare. So that was extremely important. We also thought it was very important to understand the language that Hamas was using and that became incorporated into so many slogans. So both Asaf and I know Arabic, but we drew on scholars who study Islamic texts and know the history of these texts in the Muslim world. And so we wanted to bring that up as well. We're not lawyers. we reached out to people who know international law to show that the architecture that has been created about human rights and about the framework of international conflict resolution has been corrupted over the years in many ways, and the corruption is no greater than in its focus on Israeli actions and defense. And of course, we both Asaf and I are heavily involved in viewing what transpires on the campus, and I think one of the unusual chapters in the study is the degree to which certain pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian campus organizations, how they're funded, how well they're funded, how easily or how deeply they reach into state, local, and federal funding. So this is a very well-funded set of operations, and it's global, not simply American, though we focused heavily on America. And then we looked at the Israeli political system. And I think a reader of this volume is going to find differences within the chapters. Different foci, different interpretations, and that's fine. It's not as if we as academicians think that there's one way to understand everything. What we tried to do was to establish the beginning of a record based on 1.5 years of sources that we could work with, knowing that there will be more sources and more revelations that might revise our views of this or that. Above all, we believe strongly, we're committed strongly to the study of the Middle East on campus by honest and traditional academicians who look at what's happening with regard to facts and history and things that are provable, not simply a story that sounds nice and that you want. And to prove that it's possible to do this with undergraduates, we have a chapter from an undergraduate who was given an assignment to write about the sexual violations in the attacks on October 7th. Her chapter is not even minimally edited because we wanted to illustrate that this comes from, I think at the time, she was a sophomore, junior in college, and a women's studies major, not someone whose major one might think would produce something comprehensive. But when you have professors who are dealing with these events with some integrity and with attention to what can be said reasonably, logically, you can produce understanding.
Mm-hmm. I want to get into a couple of those topics, especially, the chapter, by the student about sexual violence. But let me just pause for a moment and ask you, you describe yourself as someone who has taught for 4 decades, taught these subjects. And what happened in the last 2 years was kind of this, how shocked were you? How have you wrapped your head around the way, this sort of pro-Hamas movement, which I don't think is too strong to describe it in that way, in many respects, sort of sees, sort of the zeitgeist of, of young Americans, of people on campus in a way that I'm not sure that any movement. I know that, there was the Black Lives Matter, but, in the summer of 2020, but school was out then, and I'm not sure that had the same impact. I don't think there's been anything in academia like this sort of pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas movement since the anti-war movement, during the Vietnam War, which is, a long, 50, 60 years ago. Why did that happen? And how have you reacted to it as someone who has really some perspective on these issues as well as on, life on campuses?
I can tell you that I was profoundly disappointed, profoundly shocked, because number one, many of the protesters and professors who began to celebrate October 7th as a matter of liberation and would sometimes cite Frantz Fanon's reflections on the wretched of the earth and his chapter on reflections on violence. Well, I've taught that book. It's nice to teach chapter 1, but one would think you'd want to teach chapters 2, 3, and 4, which give a very sobering view of what post-colonial liberation would be. I was shocked at the extent to which university heads, some of whom I once counted as close friends, came out with speeches about respecting the strong feelings of one or another side. But I never found one university elite college head to say, go and study, go and learn. There was a sense in which feelings replace thinking on college campus. And that's something that I, from my undergraduate days, was taught not to value. You can. I taught at Smith College, as you know, and I probably I never counted the Jews or non-Jews or whatever in my class, but I taught far more Muslims from Pakistan and Saudi Arabian princesses who came to Smith. I taught far more Arabs and Muslims than I did Jews at Smith in my 40 years. And we studied, we looked at texts. And I would say in the course in the various courses I developed on the Middle East conflict or the Israeli-Arab conflict, however, Palestinians, I would say that my job is to teach you how to think about the Middle East, not what to think. You're entitled to your own political view, but the way in which we discuss these issues in class, the way in which you have to write about these issues has to conform to a certain set of standards. And my classes were filled. You don't get tenure and promotion in at least in the era in which I was an academician without having large classes and without having positive feedback in teaching, and you have to publish. Let me say just a word about the 60s riots, because I was a student at Columbia. I happened to be doing research in Israel in 67, 68 when the campus blew up. But I studied Turkish with a roommate of Mark Rudd, if you remember that name.
Oh, yes, Mark Rudd, yes, of course. I went to Columbia a bit after that, but Mark Rudd was still a name. He was the leader of Students for a Democratic Society, the leader of sort of the the movement that blew up Colombia in the spring of '68. Yeah.
Right. But at the very least, that movement, however silly it became, that movement had an objective that was doable to raise issues about Vietnam and whether it was the right war to be in or whether college students should be drafted. And the second thing they had was dates. The guys wanted, this was, sort of the beginning of not only free speech, free love. So there were sort of concrete objectives. The idea of globalizing the intifada and some general idea of redistributing wealth on a global scale, all of these were unrealizable goals.
Yeah. So basically you're saying to compare the Hamas movement with the anti-war movement is an insult to the anti-war movement, I guess, in some ways.
Right. The anti-war movement had its problems as well, but at least you had a better idea of what they wanted.
Right. Well, let's focus for a moment on one of the subjects that is addressed in one of the chapters in your book, the erasure of Hamas in the human rights narrative about October 7th and the war. How and why did that happen? That it really seems, totally, out of kind of crazy. I mean, Hamas started the war. It drove it. It was why it continued as long as it did. Why did Hamas get sort of written out of it and it just became a focus on like all the bad things that Israel was supposedly doing?
Well, I think there are several reasons, and it exploded after October 7th, but it was germinating before on the college campuses with a change in vocabulary. Sort of stemming to a great extent, but not entirely, from the work of Edward Said and Orientalism. And now Edward Said was a professor of comparative literature, English literature.
Another person at Columbia, I might add.
Right, another, although he had wanted to be at Harvard, I gather. But he was possibly disappointed. At any rate, what he took from literature, I mean, literary critics do this in many different ways. They don't need an anecdote, let's say, or they don't need something that happens in a novel to have any historical veracity or proof. And it can lead to many, many creative ideas. You can spin ideas. And so Edward Said began to spin, in a sense, began the idea that colonialism was really a movement that was a product of Western belief in its own superiority. So what it did by expanding the range of its political dominions was to debase the understanding, degrade the understanding of the people it subjected. Now, I don't want to get into the debate about the credibility of Said's argument, but the point is, what may have worked as a nice literary text doesn't work actually when you get around to history. So Israel, it became part of colonialism. And if colonialism was bad, Israel as its product, as its output, had to be as evil as the original force. But in fact, when you look at World War I, which dismantled the Ottoman Empire, over which had control over what then became mandated Palestine and Israel and this part of the world, it was not only the Zionists who were somehow connected to the British rule in over Palestine, or the British justified its rule by supporting the idea of a national home, the so-called Balfour Declaration. But that doesn't describe, or that doesn't end the relationship between the British and other Arab regimes that evolved after World War I. The British created Transjordan. The British created Iraq, or delimited Iraq. The British agreed to allow the French to rule over Syria and Lebanon. So all of the Middle East, let's say, was a byproduct of post-Ottoman rule in the Middle East. And it wasn't that the Palestinians said, okay, we're not going to associate with the British because they're colonialists and they're evil. The Palestinian leaders themselves, almost instantly at the end of World War I, set up delegations to try to persuade the British to support either a large Arab state as a successor to the Ottomans, or a large Syrian entity. They failed. And they didn't stop sending representatives to try to convince the British that they should support the Arabs or the Palestinians, an Arab population. They just failed to make their case for a while, until the British tried to find a kind of middle ground compromise with the Peel proposal in 1937 to divide the land, to give 80% of Palestine, of Mandate Palestine, to the Palestinians, to the Arab population, and 20% to the Jews at that point, 1937. The Zionist leadership said, well, we don't like the percentage, but we'll accept the idea. We want to share the land. The Palestinians said, no, all or nothing. And that's been a continuous policy goal of almost every Palestinian leader, even Yasser Arafat, who joined the Oslo Accords, and one would think that's accepting the principle of sharing the land, withdrew from that in the Second Intifada. So the question is sharing the land. The Palestinians could have had a state that probably, had they accepted the Peel partition, would have evolved into almost 80% of Palestine. They preferred, actually, even the next year, the Palestinian leadership outsourced control over the fate of Palestine to the Arab states, so that they wouldn't have to bear the burden of any kind of compromise. In 1947, the partition resolution gave the Palestinians or apportioned to the Palestinians about 65% of the land. They rejected that because it was at that point in Arab hands largely, although that was supported by some prominent Palestinian leaders. And in Oslo, we were talking about 22 or so % of the land. What continued as a goal of the Palestinian movement seemed to be the principle of not sharing any part of the land with some sort of Jewish sovereign entity, political entity. And the trend has been from 80% to, and it's probably under 22% at this point. So statehood doesn't seem to be the primary issue or on the Palestinian agenda. Instead, the Palestinians have done, and very cleverly, wrapped themselves into many of the institutions that evolved since the end of the Second World War that are supposed to manage conflict, international conflict. They became integrated into UNRWA, the refugee for Palestinian refugees, so that ironically, the purpose of the major UN organization to deal with Palestinian refugees was not to resolve their issue and to end their issue as refugees, but rather to perpetuate and to grow it. And that's an important cash resource for the United Nations. They've been able to expand their organizational presence in the United Nations through a special committee on Palestine, through being able to appoint sympathizers to various UN agencies. So they've been very clever and successful thus far about their international outreach. And their international outreach has brought many millions, if not billions, to leaders of the Palestinian movement, and at least a minimal standard of living to ordinary Palestinians. Now, that comes with high risk because every once in a while, wars break out, violence breaks out. That's supposed to sustain resistance.
Yeah. So basically, but that resistance and its form in Hamas basically got written out of how people talked about human rights in this conflict. And basically, I guess what you're saying is because the Palestinians sort of chose this path, they still, the whole point is that they're the aggrieved party and they're in the right and the Israelis are in the wrong no matter what they do, no matter what Hamas does or what Palestinians do. It fits into this structure of, we're the good guys, we're the oppressed, the Israelis are the white oppressors. And that's how everybody thinks about it, or at least everybody who sort of listens to this sort of narrative.
Some of the academicians who've written more recently about genocide have changed the definition of genocide. I mean, most people think of genocide as trying to eliminate or kill off an entire people, the genocide that occurred during the Holocaust.
Yeah, the word was coined in the aftermath of the Holocaust by, Raphael Lemkin, a sort of Polish Zionist, to describe what had happened, what was attempted in the Holocaust.
Right. But now someone like Dirk Moses, who's got a chaired professorship at CUNY, and was editor of the Journal of Genocide, and did his early work. He's Australian. He did very good work on Australia and indigenous populations, changed the definition of genocide to include depriving a people of agency. And so the Palestinians are considered a people without agency. And the reason they're considered a people without agency is because of Israel. In fact, if they are deprived of agency, they've been deprived by their own choices and their own leaders. But that's another story. So the notion that human rights organizations have to protect the weak, that's their ultimate goal. The Palestinians have defined themselves as the avatars of weakness, and they're proud of it.
Now, in the introduction to this book, which was written by Asaf, he speaks about Hamas's use of extreme violence as something, and using that phrase exactly, as something that was intentional as a tactic, as well as a strategy for engendering support for their cause. And I think this colors much of the discussion. It's kind of counterintuitive in that in a rational world, you would think atrocities ought to generate revulsion and not sympathy for the perpetrators. Why did the opposite happen in so much of the discourse, in this war over words about October 7th?
Let me step back for 1 second. If you compare October 7th with some of the brutality of ISIS in Mosul, there the Americans and the Allies were able to draw a circle around those atrocities, focus on those atrocities, and go after ISIS to try to eliminate ISIS in Mosul. Do we know how many innocent victims in Mosul were killed? No. Did we have protests? No. So that October 7th, in a sense, if you want to sustain the notion of Palestinian resistance and Israeli oppression against Palestinians, in a sense, logically, you had to elevate your own violence to match what was happening on the ground. You had to either deny that it happened, as we saw in a recent decision by the UN Commission on Women's Rights, denied any rape and any sexual violence, even though the Hamas perpetrators were proud of it and videoed some of it, so that you have to either deny it or you have to say that the violence was justifiable and that the violence is something to endorse and support with your own violence by using it to target any group or any entity that somehow, directly or indirectly, can be linked to supporting Israel. So you can go after Zionists on campus. You can talk about introducing a resolution against genocide and stopping sending military equipment to Israel. It's been used to target Jewish patients in hospitals by doctors who seem to ignore what I thought was an ironclad professional rule of the Hippocratic Oath. But so if you support this, in a sense, it's incumbent upon you to equal it, to say, well, there's something righteous about that violence, and we not only have to uphold it, we have to reproduce it.
Yeah, and it's about demonizing the victims as well. I mean, I think,
Right.
It's noted throughout the book that, sort of treating, you mentioned Fanon, it's sort of treating the Jewish victims of October 7th as if they had it coming.
That's exactly right. And not only Zionism, which is an incredibly complex phenomenon and has as much argument within it as without, now becomes a dirty word. I mean, can you imagine if we would have laughed even 2 years ago or 3 years ago if if a Harvard Crimson article was focused on, can you be friends with a Zionist? This is Harvard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's where we are now in terms of the demonizing of Jews, of their movement, of their state. And in part, it's because this violence was so extreme. Yeah.
Right. The more extreme the violence, the more justifiable, because this would only come from extraordinary evil perpetrated on these people. These people are innocent. They're innocent by definition. Even the Arabic term Nakba, which is really a word for like a weather catastrophe, was used originally as a point of self-criticism by an Arab professor who is definitely anti-Semitic, who said, look, 7 Arab states were defeated by these Jews. We've got to modernize. We've got to build up our military. It wasn't a term that is now used by the Palestinians as a disaster, an inner disaster, a deprivation that happened to Palestinians and changed the Palestinian collective characteristic and weakened it into a group without the ability to act for itself except through violence.
Yeah. Now, Donna, in your conclusion to the book, you speak of the way October 7th was not just a terrorist attack, but an attempt to erase history and sort of to reverse the results of Israel's War of Independence, but which Palestinians treat as the Nakba, as you just said, the disaster. Why is there so much sympathy in the world for reversing this one historical chapter and not the hundreds, if not thousands, of other conflicts around the world in which there have always been winners and losers? Why is this one somehow so sympathetic, this wanting to turn back the clock in a way that in terms of other conflicts, people would just say, well, just it's what happened. You can't, sort of like the Germans who were thrown out of East Prussia after World War II. It's just sort of, well, tough luck. You lost the war. Nobody says that about the Palestinians.
I wonder if it's really about the Jews.
Yeah, well, I think that's a pretty obvious conclusion. Yeah.
Jewish history, I'm in synagogue every Saturday, every Shabbat, and what's called the Great Hallel, which reminds people of Sichon, the king of the Amorites, and Oz, the king of Bashan. And I say, who would remember those two people except for, Jewish texts? Jews have been around for a very long time. Anyone who wants to apply the word indigeneity to this area can find plenty of evidence from Jewish history and Jewish archaeology, Jewish remnants, And when you look at Palestinian names, by the way, they come from post-Umayyad conquest. They're Arabian, not Palestinian, but we can leave that for a minute. So the Jews have done well. After the horrific attempt to eliminate European Jewry, there was resilience among the remnants and the survivors and rebuilding Israel. Israel is certainly not perfect, as you can tell from my views in that chapter, but it put power into the hands of people, knowing that people make mistakes, but they're the ones who accept responsibility for those mistakes, are supposed to learn from those mistakes, and certainly we try, and supposed to rebuild better next time. And it's interesting that Jews are a very small percentage of the world, or of any country except for Israel, and yet we're considered enormously powerful, to the point of people being afraid of Jewish power. So I think that if the Palestinians had been fighting the Turks, there wouldn't be this enormous sympathy or interest.
Yeah, I think that's clear. Now, part of this is the way, as you wrote, Donna, the way the Palestinian identity became a trope for powerlessness and a metaphor for righteous redemption through violence. Can't help but think that the outside of the context of fashionable leftist theories about the world, like critical race theory, intersectionality, settler colonialism, nobody would listen to this kind of really delusional thinking. But yet, because of the success of progressives in mainstreaming these ideas, what, for lack of a better term, we could call Palestinianism, has become ubiquitous, even if most of those who advocate for it, especially a lot of the students on college campuses, know very little about the topic. How did, it's really part of the context of how we think about the world and other issues, isn't it?
Right. And they know, I should add, very little about the complexities of social justice. There's this notion that the state itself is problematic. And if we erase borders and we redistribute wealth worldwide, we'll have social justice, so that sort of the Davids are given power through the UN or through social justice movements to take on the Goliaths of, America, Great Britain, France. But that's such simple-minded thinking. And perhaps it's a consequence, even at Columbia, where I thought they still taught the core curriculum, and started with Plato and went to Aristotle. I mean, maybe they dismissed that now. But these are very complex issues.
I believe the contemporary civilization curriculum is still in place, although I believe it's been watered down a bit. But question is, you can assign books, but it doesn't mean people that will read and understand them.
Right. But I think, the word think itself has become controversial on college campuses. When you have the word of the year by dictionary.com, I guess that's Merriam-Webster, being 6, 7, and they can't define it. It's a feel. It's a rap. It's it's something you get when you keep saying it. It's a strange time, and to me, the professors I had, and I went to Brandeis when Marcuse was teaching. the professors I had would think about this, would interrogate this. What does it mean? And you still need people to look in the mirror and see what they're doing.
Yeah. And they're not doing that.
It's a profoundly disappointing thing for me to see leaders of higher education worrying about, well, can they hold graduation without protests? That's and are they going to preserve money for this or that? And it's not to say that there isn't good teaching still going on, but you don't hear about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Clearly. One of the most important elements of the post-October 7th discussion is, as we've already mentioned, the denial of sexual violence as a tactic, as well as the ability of those who support Hamas and the Palestinians to also insist, that the Israeli women had it coming, that they were like slave owners, in pre-Civil War America. How has it been possible for such a position to be mainstreamed? After everything that has changed about our society in the last half century, after Me Too, and the transformation of the discussion about sexual violence in every other context, except attacks on Jews.
Your observations that go into that question are correct, and we saw this. We saw this coming, I think, before October 7th. I think the Black Lives Matter movement and the Women's March, and the extent to which protests are focused against Donald Trump, not against this issue or that issue, not trying to resolve it. So that you had the Women's March, I believe, was a year or two before October 7th, and Zionists weren't allowed to march. And I think progressives are torn, or at least people who believe in progressivism are torn in their loyalties. And I think that's what you're seeing played out with regard to the sexual violence that occurred on October 7th and that is being denied in one place or another. Do you want to preserve your credentials as a progressive, or do you want to preserve your credentials as a Jew? Or no one seems to, or too few people seem to care about preserving their credentials as a reasonable, accurate human being capable of making decisions. But I also think there's also something else that I haven't mentioned and ought to be mentioned, that is that the protesters supporting Hamas and denying one or another, or really accusing Israel and the people who were savagely and brutally killed of being the cause of all this violence. The one thing is, they make a lot of noise. They control a lot of cultural, of the elite cultural institutions, the legacy press, or a lot of the media. We know they have loud voices. We don't know how deeply that those views are entrenched among most people. I have to believe that most people are more rational.
Well, I hope so. But we also know that antisemitism is growing. It's surged since October 7th. And that's sort of part of my next question, which was another key element, and it's discussed in the book, is understanding the way this discussion has played out is the bizarre red-green alliance of Marxists and Islamists in Europe as well as on campuses. How do these two groups, whose views about many, if not most issues, are antithetical to each other, work so well together? Is it the pull of intersectionality or just the common appeal of antisemitism, which, is just never dies, just keeps, it's a virus, it transforms itself, to the circumstances. And, as we're seeing in the United States now, it's pervasive on the left, and it's also very much alive on the right.
Yes. And I think you do see a kind of green Islamist alliance because it's politically useful. It expands the base for each. Neither is in a position to push it to where you're actually making policies and you might have to make choices. It's a force of opposition that binds them at this point. Certainly, I'm persuaded by some of the writing regarding the college campuses and the elites. We've in the United States, and I assume in Great Britain, we've overproduced elites. And if you can eliminate the Jews as competition for whatever in whatever way, that helps other groups get gain advantages in seeking jobs and seeking positions. I think there is something like that going on.
Yeah, it's pretty sinister, but it is part of what's happening. Now, finally, what did you learn in the course of working on this project that you hadn't fully understood before or realized before you began it, or even on October 6th of 2023? What have you come to understand that maybe you never would have believed before this?
I guess there are a couple of things, and I still don't have the answers. I'm still shocked. I mean, we've seen since October 7th, 2023, we've seen some amazingly brilliant tactics and maneuvers by the Israeli military. And then when you look at the reports, there hasn't been a state investigation, an all-consuming investigation, but there have been individual military reports of what happened at one or another base in the Gaza envelope, or some of the reports from the different kibbutzim that were attacked. And the stark difference between the extraordinary brilliance of the Israeli military and just the failures and neglect, I think that's something that needs to be addressed. There need to be inquiries, and it's something that I, can't find hard to explain to this day. And we're going to find out, one of the parts of the UN resolution that was passed by the Security Council and the plan by the Trump administration to rehabilitate and rule Gaza going forward is dismantling Hamas, dismantling the weapons, the Hamas weapons, and disarming Hamas. Now, most people, when they think of that, think of rockets and rocket launchers and, missiles. But really, it's the tunnel system. And it's the tunnel system that is yet to find an easy way to dismantle that's cost effective. And it's enormous, that as we know, that tunnel system. And how all of this could be built without Israel having an inkling of how extensive it was is still something that shocks me.
Yeah, I think historians are going to be chewing over these issues long after we're both gone. There's a lot to the contradictions are enormous. That's kind of true in any conflict that you study, that there's always these, amazing things, and these just extraordinary human beings are capable of, great stupidity and blindness, as well as great heroism and insights. But that is our condition. That's all the time we have for this. Donna, thanks so much for joining us today and for your insights on this important work. Can you tell us how our viewers and listeners can follow your work and where they can get this new book?
The book is available at Amazon. I tend to write blogs for the Times of Israel.
Well, we'll forgive you for that.
I've been lucky enough to be edited by Jonathan Tobin, so...
Yes, you've also appeared in JNS, and we welcome you to come back whenever you like.
Thank you. Thank you for this.
We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to read JNS at jns.org and subscribe to our newsletters, and also to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the audio podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us there or watching us live on Facebook or X or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.